I found two armed men in tactical gear standing in the middle of my vineyard at sunrise, and the problem was I wasn't even in their HOA, not even close, but they stood there like they owned every vine and every clod of dirt under their boots. You know, sunrise on a vineyard has this way of being quiet, almost holy, where the light hits the Cabernet leaves and turns the dew into something that looks like crushed diamonds. And I've lived long enough to know that when that kind of peace is interrupted, it's usually by something that doesn't mean you any good. I was out there by the south row, just tightening some trellis wire and enjoying the smell of damp earth when I saw them. Two silhouettes, dark navy uniforms, sidearms on their hips in those cheap, stiff holsters that scream and quote, "I wish I were a real cop," end quote. Now, birdwatchers don't carry Glocks and hikers don't move in a perimeter sweep, so I just stood there, letting the grease from the wire stain my palms, and I watched them until they noticed me. On their sleeves was a patch that looked like a badge, but instead of a star, it had a little stylized cedar tree and the words in quote, "Blackwood Heights Community Enforcement," end quote. I almost laughed because Blackwood Heights was the gated community 3 miles down the road, the kind of place where people get fined for having the wrong shade of beige on their curtains. And my land? My land was 10 acres of independent soil that had never been and would never be part of their little suburban kingdom. The tall one, a guy with a military fade and a jawline he'd clearly practiced in a mirror, stepped forward and tapped a clipboard like it was a holy relic, telling me they were conducting a, end quote, "routine safety and environmental perimeter assessment," end quote. I just stared at him for a long beat, the kind of silence that makes a man like that start to sweat, and I asked him what the hell he was doing on private property that didn't belong to his association. He gave me this smirk, the kind that says, end quote, "I have paperwork and you have dirt under your fingernails," end quote. And he told me that because my vineyard bordered their, end quote, "safety buffer zone," end quote, they had secondary jurisdiction for oversight. Secondary jurisdiction. I've heard a lot of fancy ways to say, end quote, trespassing, end quote, in my time, especially back when I was a detective in the city, but this was a new level of delusion. I told him to get off my land before I stopped being polite, and for a second, I saw his partner reach for the button on his vest, probably trying to activate a body cam that wasn't into oppos, to even turn on, just a blinking red light for show. I didn't oppose, TL, I just took one slow step forward, the kind of step that tells a man the talking part of the morning is over, and they eventually backed off, muttering about, end quote, non-compliance, end quote, and, end quote, official documentation, end quote. But I knew right then that this wasn't oppos, T and ending. It was just the first ripple before a very ugly storm. A few days later, the real trouble arrived in an aging silver Tahoe that crawled up my gravel drive like it was stalking prey, and out stepped a man named Miller Vance, a guy built like an old linebacker who'd gone to seed, but still wanted everyone to think he could hit. He had on these aviator shades and a jacket with a faded county sheriff's patch that looked like it had been bought at a surplus store, and he introduced himself as the, end quote, chief of security, end quote, for the HOA. He didn't in oppos. T look at the vines or the hills. He just looked at me with that gaze men use when they're deciding if they can break you or if they have to trick you instead. He started talking about, end quote, community standards, end quote, and, end quote, neighborly cooperation, end quote. But what he was really saying was that he didn't in oppos. T like an independent vineyard sitting on the edge of his manicured map, a place he couldn't in oppos. T control. I've dealt with bullies and I've dealt with liars, but Miller had that specific kind of unhinged energy that comes from a man who once had a little bit of real power, lost it, and was now desperate to build a new throne out of HOA bylaws and intimidation. I told him my gate didn't in oppos. T opened for fantasy titles, only for real warrants, and he took those shades off, revealing eyes that were pale and cold, telling me that if, end quote, something happened, end quote, out here I shoot in oppos. T expect the community to look the other way. Then the harassment started, and it wasn't in oppos. T loud, it was just constant, like a slow leak in a pipe that eventually rots the floorboards. I get a knock at the door at 10 p.m. from a real sheriff's deputy, looking embarrassed as hell, saying they'd received a call about, end quote, suspicious chemical runoff, end quote, or, end quote, unsecured firearms, end quote, and every time they look around, see nothing but grapevines and a locked tool shed, and apologize for wasting my time. I knew who was calling, and I knew why. Miller was trying to build a paper trail, trying to paint me as the, in quote, problem neighbor, in quote, so he could justify whatever move he was planning next. I started finding things, drones hovering over my porch at dusk, footprints near my fermentation tanks, and then the cameras. I was out fixing an irrigation line when I saw a glint of light from a utility pole near my fence. And when I climbed up, I found a professional-grade bullet camera with a Blackwood Heights sticker on the side, pointed right at my front door. Most people would have ripped it down or called a lawyer, but I knew guys like Miller. If you take away their toys, they just buy bigger ones, but if you let them watch, they eventually get cocky enough to show you exactly who they are. So I started playing a character for him, a little theater for his hidden lenses, because I knew he was sitting in some basement or garage somewhere, staring at those monitors and waiting for me to slip up. I'd spend my evenings on the porch, sipping a glass of wine and staring directly into the lens of his hidden cameras, just letting him know that I saw him, that I wasn't an oppos, afraid, and that his little spy game was the highlight of my day. But then it crossed a line. I found a USB drive jammed into the port of my own private security system, a crude attempt at injecting malware to reroute my feeds to an external server. That's when I realized Miller wasn't an oppos. Just a cranky guy with a clipboard. He was obsessed, and he was being enabled by someone with deep pockets. I did a little digging of my own old-school detective work, and I found out that the HOA president, a woman named Evelyn Reed who looked like she'd stepped out of a high-end country club ad, was funneling, in quote, security fees, in quote, into a private account that Miller was using for his surveillance gear. They were embezzlement partners, using the HOA's treasury to fund a private war against anyone who wooed into oppos, bow to their rules. That's when I decided to set the honeypot, a trap built specifically for a man with a hero complex and a lack of actual common sense. I had my nephew, a big kid who looks like he could be hauling anything, help me move some heavy, plain white bag from the shed to the back of my truck, right under the nose of Miller's favorite camera. We whispered, we looked over our shoulders, we acted like we were handling something that would get us 20 years in federal prison, and I made sure the lighting was just dim enough to make those bags of organic grape fertilizer and brewer's yeast look like high-grade narcotics. I even let a few phrases slip, and quote, get the powder inside before the sun comes up, in quote, and in quote, this is the big shipment Miller can't know about, in quote, knowing damn well he was recording every word. I went to bed that night feeling kind of calm. I hadn't into oppos. Felt in years because I knew that a man like Miller wooed into oppos. Be able to resist the urge to play the big city hero and take me down in a blaze of glory. Sure enough, the next evening, while I was hosting a small barbecue for a few old friends, mostly retired guys from the department who still knew how to handle themselves, the gates didn't into oppos. Just opened. They were practically breached. Miller vans came flying up the drive in that Tahoe, followed by two HOA, in quote, enforcement, in quote, cars, and he jumped out wearing a tactical vest with, in quote, chief, in quote, plastered across the front in gold letters. He was screaming about and quote, citizens and oppos, arrest, in quote, and in quote, controlled substances, in quote. His face turned a shade of purple that I genuinely thought might be a medical emergency, and he had his hand on his holster like he was waiting for an excuse to draw. My friend just sat there, holding their ribs and trying not to laugh, as Miller stormed over to the truck and sliced open one of the bags with a hunting knife, swearing he'd finally caught the, in quote, kingpin, in quote, of the valley. He yanked the bag open so hard that a massive cloud of fine, white powder, pure, concentrated wine yeast, exploded right into his face, coating his hair, his aviators, and his lungs in a thick, sticky film of fermentation starter. He stood there coughing and sputtering, looking like a powdered donut in a tactical vest, while I calmly pulled out my phone and showed the real sheriff's deputies, who had arrived just minutes after Miller, the footage of him trespassing and the logs of his illegal surveillance. You see, the beautiful thing about Miller was his ego. He had recorded his own crimes, thinking they were evidence against me, and when the deputies saw the malware logs and the cameras he'd planted on private property, the handcuffs didn't in oppos go on me. They went on Miller. It turns out, when you mace yourself with grape yeast while trying to play cop on land you have zero jurisdiction over, the legal system doesn't and oppos tend to be very sympathetic. But the real kicker came a month later during the discovery phase of his trial. It turned out that Evelyn Reed hadn't and oppos. T just been funding Miller. She'd been using his surveillance to blackmail other HOA members into voting for her in, quote, beautification, in, quote, projects, which were really just fronts for her husband's construction company. Miller got slapped with felony stalking, wiretapping, and impersonating an officer, and Evelyn is currently staring down a decade for embezzlement and racketeering. The Blackwood Heights HOA was essentially dissolved by a court-appointed receiver because the Treasury was a black hole of illegal kickbacks. And now, the, in quote, Community Enforcement Unit, in quote, is nothing more than a few abandoned navy blue shirts in a dumpster. I'm back to my sunrise rituals now, and the only silhouettes I see in my vineyard are the deer who think they have a right to my grapes, which, honestly, I'm much more inclined to negotiate with. I put up a new sign at the edge of the property, right where the gravel meets the road. It doesn't in oppos, T saying, quote, no trespassing, in quote, or in quote, private property, in quote, it just says, in quote, welcome to independent ground. Leave the clipboard at the gate, in quote. It makes me wonder, though, how many of these little suburban dictators are out there right now, staring at monitors and dreaming of a badge they never earned. And what happens when they finally run into someone who knows exactly how to let them ruin themselves? Have you ever had a neighbor who thought they owned the air you breathe, or an HOA that forgot where their property line actually ended? I'd love to hear if I'm the only one who had to turn his vineyard into a sting operation just to get some peace and quiet, or if this kind of madness is spreading faster than the weeds in July.